On a map of North America, we drift slowly westward along the wide sweep of the continent until the land tightens into mountains. The year is 1846, and on the eastern edge of those peaks, in what will one day be called the Sierra Nevada, a small wagon train will meet an early winter it cannot pass. In the months ahead, about 80 immigrants will attempt a journey of more than 2,000 miles from the frontier towns of Missouri to the distant valleys of California. Their route will carry them across open prairie, desert basins, and finally into high mountain passes, where snow can fall suddenly and stay. Later generations will remember them under a single name, the Donner Party. Their story has been told in many ways, sometimes with more drama than care. Tonight we will walk through it slowly, quietly, and as gently as history allows. We will stay with the ordinary details, the creak of wagon wheels, the glow of lanterns in canvas tents, the hush of falling snow outside a small log cabin. By minute 2, we will be standing in a muddy Missouri town, watching families load the last of their belongings into white-topped wagons. By minute 4, we will be out on the open prairie, where the trail stretches ahead in a faint line, and the nights are lit by campfires under a wide spring sky. By minute 6, we will have reached the foothills of the Sierra, looking up at a narrow pass that still seems open, though winter is closer than anyone wishes to believe. This is a calm, non-graphic telling. We will acknowledge hunger, loss, and the desperate choices some made, including consuming the remains of those who had already died. But we will do so in neutral, respectful language. You do not need to brace yourself. You can simply listen and let the small scenes and steady footsteps carry you. If your thoughts are already beginning to wander, that is welcome. We are only setting our place on the map at the beginning of a long road west. The town of Independence, Missouri, sits at the edge of the known world in the spring of 1846. Beyond its muddy streets and low wooden buildings, the land opens into grass and sky, stretching westward toward mountains that most residents have never seen. This is where the journey begins. In the weeks before departure, the streets are crowded with activity. Wagons roll in from surrounding farms, their beds empty and waiting to be filled. Blacksmiths work from dawn until dark, hammering iron rims onto wheels and shaping the hardware that will hold axles and tongues together over thousands of miles. The sound of their hammers rings across the town, steady and purposeful. Families arrive from Illinois, from Ohio, from the small towns scattered across the Midwest. They come seeking land, opportunity, a new beginning in the fertile valleys of California. Some have sold farms and businesses to fund the journey. Others have pooled resources with neighbors and relatives, forming loose partnerships that will travel together for safety and companionship. Among those gathering in Independence are the Donner and Reed families. George Donner is a prosperous farmer from Illinois, traveling with his wife Tamsin and their children. His brother Jacob brings his own family. James Reed, also from Illinois, arrives with his wife Margaret, their 4 children, and Margaret's elderly mother. The Reeds travel in some comfort. Their wagon is larger than most, fitted with a small stove and built-in bunks, designed for the long months ahead. There are others too, families named Breen, Murphy, Graves, and Eddy. There are single men hopping to find work or land in California, and hired teamsters who will drive the oxen and handle the animals. In all, the party will eventually number about 80 souls, though the exact count shifts as families join and leave along the way. The wagons themselves are a study in careful preparation. Each one is packed according to the advice found in guidebooks and letters from those who have made the journey before. Flour and bacon, coffee and sugar, dried beans and rice. Tools for repairs, extra axles, spare wheels, chains and ropes. Clothing for all seasons, though most travelers pack light, expecting to reach California before winter. Bedding, cookware, a few treasured possessions that families cannot bear to leave behind. The oxen stand patiently in corrals, waiting to be yoked. These are the true engines of the journey, slow but strong, capable of pulling heavy loads across difficult terrain. Some families also bring milk cows, horses for riding and herding, and dogs that will trot alongside the wagons day after day. In the evenings before departure, lanterns glow in the windows of boarding houses and camps at the edge of town. Families gather to share meals and conversation, to introduce themselves to those who will become their neighbors for the months ahead. There is excitement in these gatherings, and also quiet anxiety. The journey is long, the route uncertain, and everyone knows that not all who set out will reach their destination. The morning of departure arrives under a gray sky. Wagons line up along the road leading west, their white canvas tops swaying gently in the breeze. Families make final checks, tightening ropes, adjusting loads, saying goodbye to relatives who have come to see them off. Children peer out from wagon openings, their eyes wide with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. Then the call goes out, and the train begins to move. Oxen lean into their yokes. Wheels creak and groan as they roll over the rutted road. The town falls behind, first the buildings, then the fences, then the last scattered farms. Ahead, the trail stretches into open country, a faint line across the grass leading toward the horizon. The first night on the trail is a revelation. The wagons form a loose circle, wheels touching, creating a kind of temporary village in the middle of the prairie. Fires spring up inside the ring, their smoke rising into the evening air. Families cook simple meals over open flames, bacon and cornbread, coffee boiled in tin pots. The sound of voices carries across the camp, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the occasional bark of a dog. Above them, the sky opens into a vast dome of stars. Many of the travelers have never seen the night sky so clearly, without the glow of towns or the obstruction of trees. They stand in small groups looking up, feeling both very small and strangely hopeful. The journey has begun. Lanterns hang from wagon tongues and tent poles, casting small circles of yellow light against the darkness. Inside the wagons, children settle into their blankets, rocked gently by the slight sway of the canvas walls. Their parents sit nearby, talking quietly, making plans for tomorrow. Beyond the firelight, the prairie stretches in every direction, silent and waiting. If your attention has wandered, we are with the wagons just outside town, the fields behind us and the long trail ahead. The days settle into a rhythm. Each morning begins before dawn, when the first light appears as a thin gray line along the eastern horizon. Someone stirs the coals of the previous night's fire, adding kindling until flames catch and spread. Coffee is made, breakfast prepared, often the same simple fare as dinner, eaten quickly while the camp comes alive around them. The oxen are brought in from where they have been grazing and yoked to their wagons. This is careful work, requiring patience and strength. The animals are large and sometimes reluctant, but they respond to familiar voices and hands. Once yoked, they stand waiting, their breath visible in the cool morning air. By the time the sun clears the horizon, the wagon train is moving. The pace is slow, perhaps 2 miles an hour, 15 miles on a good day, sometimes less. The landscape is vast and seemingly unchanging, a rolling sea of grass that stretches to every horizon. The sky above is enormous, pale blue in the morning, deepening through the day, often streaked with clouds that cast moving shadows across the land. The Platte River becomes their guide. It is a wide, shallow river, often described as a mile wide and an inch deep, though this is an exaggeration. Its waters are muddy and filled with sediment, but it provides a reliable source of water for people and animals alike. The trail follows its course for hundreds of miles, the wagons moving along the flat valley while the river glimmers in the distance. Children walk beside the wagons when the terrain allows, glad to escape the jolting ride inside. They gather wild flowers, chase grasshoppers, and invent games to pass the time. Their mothers keep watch, calling them back if they stray too far. Some children carry small burdens, a water pail, a bundle of kindling, feeling proud to contribute to the daily work. The midday rest is brief. Wagons halt, oxen are unyoked to graze and drink, and families eat a cold lunch of bread and dried meat. Some travelers nap in the shade of their wagons, hats pulled over their faces. Others tend to small repairs or write in journals, documenting the miles traveled and the sights along the way. In the afternoon, the train moves again, following the trail until evening approaches. The position of the sun determines when to stop, late enough to make good progress, early enough to set up camp before dark. Finding a suitable campsite becomes a daily ritual. Level ground, access to water, grass for the animals. The evening camps are times of rest and community. Families gather around shared fires, cooking together, trading stories and news. Musicians bring out fiddles and harmonicas, and sometimes there is singing or dancing, a brief celebration after the long day's work. Children play in the fading light, their laughter carrying across the prairie. As darkness falls, the lanterns come out. They hang from wagon frames and tent poles, small points of light scattered across the camp like earthbound stars. Their glow is warm and reassuring, a signal of human presence in the vast emptiness of the plains. Families settle into their wagons or tents, pulling blankets close against the cooling air. The nights are quiet except for the sounds of the land, the rustle of grass in the wind, the calls of night birds, the occasional howl of a distant coyote. Guards are posted to watch the animals and keep the fires burning low. They walk slowly around the perimeter of the camp, their footsteps soft on the packed earth, their eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the firelight. Weeks pass in this fashion. The travelers grow accustomed to the routine, their bodies hardening to the work, their spirits settling into the steady pace of the journey. They mark progress by landmarks mentioned in their guidebooks: Courthouse Rock, Chimney Rock, the point where the trail leaves the Platte and strikes out toward the mountains. There are small frictions within the group. Disagreements about pace, about sharing resources, about whose turn it is to take the lead position on the trail where the dust is lightest. These tensions are usually resolved quietly, through conversation and compromise. The travelers know they depend on one another, and most prefer harmony to conflict. The weather is mostly kind in these early weeks. Warm days, cool nights, occasional rain that settles the dust and brings fresh growth to the grass. The animals are healthy, the wagons holding together, the supplies adequate for the miles ahead. There is reason for optimism, a sense that the journey is progressing as planned. At night, lying in their wagons or beneath canvas, The travelers listen to the wind moving across the prairie. It is a constant presence, sometimes gentle, sometimes strong, always carrying the scent of grass and earth. The sound becomes familiar, almost comforting, a reminder that the land they are crossing is alive and breathing around them. If you've been dozing, we are now on the open prairie, where days are measured in slow miles and campfires. The journey west is not a single road but a network of trails, some well established, others newly proposed. In the guidebooks and letters circulating among emigrants in 1846, one name appears with increasing frequency: Lansford Hastings. He has written a guide promoting a new route to California, a shortcut that promises to save hundreds of miles by cutting directly across the Great Basin instead of swinging north around it. The established trail follows the Snake River and then turns south toward California, a longer but tested route. Hastings claims his cutoff will bring travelers to California weeks earlier, in plenty of time before winter closes the mountain passes. His guide is optimistic, his descriptions appealing. Many emigrants are tempted. At Fort Bridger, a small trading post in the mountains of present-day Wyoming, the wagon train must make a decision. The fort is a rough collection of buildings, log cabins, a blacksmith shop, corrals for animals, run by mountain man Jim Bridger and his partner Louis Vasquez. It is one of the last places to resupply before the final push to California. Here, the travelers encounter letters and messages from Hastings himself, urging emigrants to take his cut off. He has gone ahead with an earlier party, they are told, and will wait at a certain point to guide the following wagons through the most difficult sections. The promise of a faster route is appealing, especially to those who have already spent weeks on the trail and are eager to reach their destination. The discussion within the Donna Reed party is earnest. Some argue for the safety of the established route, pointing out that it has been traveled successfully by thousands. Others are drawn to the shortcut, calculating the time saved and weighing it against the risks of an unfamiliar trail. James Reed is among those who favor trying the new route. His influence helps tip the balance. On a warm morning in late July, the wagon train turns off the main trail and heads southwest, following the faint tracks of those who have gone before. The established road continues north, toward Fort Hall and the Snake River. The Donna Reed party takes the other path, into country that few of them have seen described in any detail. At first, the cutoff seems promising. The trail crosses open country, the terrain rolling but manageable. The travelers make reasonable progress, covering 10 or 12 miles a day. Spirits remain high, buoyed by the hope that the gamble will pay off. But soon the landscape begins to change. The trail enters the Wasatch Mountains, a rugged range that blocks the way forward. The route Hastings has described is not a road but a suggestion, a general direction through canyons and ridges that have never been properly cleared for wagons. The party finds itself facing steep slopes, dense thickets of brush, and creek beds choked with boulders. Progress slows to a crawl. Some days, the entire group manages only a mile or two, every foot gained through back-breaking labor. Men take axes to the undergrowth, clearing paths wide enough for the wagons. They lever vehicles over rocks, lower them down slopes with ropes, double-team the oxen to haul them up the steepest inclines. The work is exhausting. Supplies of food and energy dwindle together. Tempers fray as the days stretch on, and the miles accumulate more slowly than anyone had expected. The shortcut that was supposed to save time is costing them dearly. When they finally emerge from the Wasatch, they face another obstacle, the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings' guide describes a crossing of perhaps 40 miles, dry but manageable. In reality, the desert stretches much farther, a vast expanse of salt and sand that takes days to cross. The party sets out at night, hopping to avoid the worst of the heat. They carry water in every available container, knowing there will be none until they reach the far side. The oxen struggle, their hooves sinking into the soft salt crust, their strength fading as the miles pass with agonizing slowness. By the end of the crossing, the damage is severe. Wagons have been abandoned, their loads scattered across the desert floor. Oxen have died or wandered off, too weak to continue. The party's supplies have been reduced, their schedule pushed further and further behind. What was supposed to be a shortcut has become a disaster. As they regroup on the far side of the desert, looking back at the white expanse they have just crossed, the travelers begin to understand the true cost of their decision. They are weeks behind schedule, their resources diminished, their animals worn. The Sierra Nevada still lies ahead, and autumn is approaching. Lanterns are lit in the evening camp, their glow a small comfort against the gathering darkness. Families sit together, speaking quietly of what has passed and what lies ahead. The optimism of earlier weeks has given way to something more cautious, more aware. The journey is no longer a simple matter of miles. It has become a question of time. Should you return to us? We are at the moment when the wagon train turns away from the well-traveled road and onto the promised cutoff. The Wasatch Mountains rise before the wagon train like a wall. Their slopes are thick with timber, their canyons narrow and choked with undergrowth. The trail that Hastings has described is more theory than reality, a general direction rather than a cleared path. The emigrants must make their own way through, Each morning begins with the same question: how far can they advance today? The answers are discouraging. A quarter mile through a brushy ravine, half a mile up a rocky slope, a full day spent clearing a path that the wagons will traverse in an hour. The work is relentless, exhausting, and seemingly endless. The men take turns with axes and saws, cutting through stands of aspen and willow, hacking at sagebrush and scrub oak. The women and older children gather the cut brush, dragging it aside to clear the way. Even the youngest help where they can, carrying water to the workers, watching over the animals, keeping the camps organized while the road building continues. The canyons are beautiful in their way, steep walls of red and gray stone, clear streams running over polished rocks, groves of quaking aspen whose leaves flutter silver in the mountain breeze. But beauty is a luxury the travelers cannot afford. Every hour spent admiring the scenery is an hour lost on the trail. The wagons themselves become obstacles. They are too wide for some passages, too heavy for some slopes. Men rig ropes to lower them down steep descents, bracing themselves against rocks and trees as the weight pulls against them. They double and triple the teams of oxen to drag the wagons up inclines that seem impossible. Wheels crack, axles bend, tongues snap under the strain. At night, the camps are quieter than they were on the prairie. Exhaustion settles over the travelers like a heavy blanket. Meals are simple and quickly eaten. Conversations are brief, focused on the next day's work. Sleep comes easily, despite the hard ground and the cold mountain air. The Donner families, traveling near the rear of the train, face particular difficulties. Their wagons are among the heaviest, their progress among the slowest. George Donner works alongside his teamsters, his hands blistered from gripping tools, his clothing torn by brush. His brother Jacob does the same. Tamsin Donner tends to the children and manages the camp, her own exhaustion carefully hidden behind a calm exterior. After nearly 3 weeks in the Wasatch, the party finally emerges onto the flats beyond. The relief is palpable. Open country again, a visible horizon, the nightmare of the canyons behind them. But there is no time to rest. The Great Salt Lake Desert lies ahead, and every day lost in the mountains is a day closer to winter. The desert crossing begins at dusk. The travelers have been warned to avoid the midday heat, to conserve water, to push through as quickly as possible. They harness the oxen and set out across the white salt flats, the ground crunching beneath wheels and hooves, the air dry and still. The first night passes without incident. The moon rises, casting a pale light across the desert, turning the salt into a ghostly plain that stretches to every horizon. The wagons move slowly but steadily, their lanterns extinguished to save fuel, their drivers navigating by the stars. But the desert is wider than anyone expected. As dawn approaches, there is no sign of the far side, only more white emptiness ahead. The sun rises, and the heat begins to build. The travelers press on, knowing they cannot stop in the middle of the crossing, knowing their water will not last if they delay. By the second day, the animals are suffering. Oxen stagger and fall, their tongues swollen, their eyes glazed. Some must be unyoked and left behind, too weak to continue. Drivers coax and plead, but there is only so much willpower can overcome. The desert is indifferent to effort. Wagons are abandoned as well, their loads shifted to surviving vehicles, their frames left standing in the salt like monuments to miscalculation. Families carry what they can, leaving behind furniture, tools, keepsakes that suddenly seem less important than survival. The white flats are scattered with the debris of the crossing. When the party finally reaches the far side of the desert, they are broken. Dozens of oxen have been lost. Wagons have been abandoned or stripped. Supplies that seemed adequate a month ago are now dangerously low. The shortcut has cost them 3 weeks and most of their margin for error. They camp beside a spring at the desert's edge, letting the animals drink their fill, letting themselves rest for the first time in days. The water is clear and cold, emerging from rocks that seem almost miraculous after the salt flats. Families sit in silence, too tired to speak, too relieved to move. In the evening, lanterns appear again, their small flames a reminder of the normalcy that has been lost and might yet be recovered. The travelers know the Sierra still lies ahead, but for tonight, they allow themselves a moment of stillness. Tomorrow, they will take stock of what remains and plan the next stage of the journey. If your thoughts have slipped away, we are now among steep canyons and salt flats, where every mile costs more than before. Beyond the Great Salt Lake Desert, the trail follows the Humboldt River across what is now Nevada. The river is a thin ribbon of water cutting through a landscape of brown hills and sagebrush, unremarkable except for its preciousness. In this dry country, any water is a gift. The Donna Reed party, diminished but still moving, follows the Humboldt westward. The pace is slower now, dictated by the surviving oxen and the need to conserve strength. The wagons that remain are packed as efficiently as possible, their loads redistributed to balance the weight. Every morning, the travelers rise and resume the march, their eyes fixed on the western horizon. The Humboldt is not a pleasant river. Its waters are alkaline, leaving a bitter taste that the animals tolerate better than the humans. Its banks are lined with coarse grass, that the oxen eat without enthusiasm. But it is water, and in the desert, water is life. Days blend together on this stretch of the journey. The routine is the same as it was on the Platte: early starts, midday rests, evening camps, but the mood has shifted. The optimism of the first weeks has given way to a quieter determination. The travelers no longer speak much about California, about the farms they will build, about the new life that awaits. They speak instead about the day's progress, about the condition of the animals, about how much farther they have to go. The landscape offers little comfort. The hills are barren, the vegetation sparse, the sky a pale, washed-out blue that offers no shade from the sun. At night, the temperature drops sharply, and families huddle in their wagons, pulling blankets close. The contrast between day and night is jarring, a reminder that they are crossing a land of extremes. Rumors reach the party as they travel. Other immigrants ahead on the trail share news of conditions in the mountains. There is talk of early snow in the Sierra, of passes that may already be difficult. The information is second-hand, uncertain, but it adds to the growing unease. The Humboldt eventually disappears into a sink, its waters absorbed by the desert floor. Beyond the sink, the trail crosses more dry country, the 40-mile desert, before reaching the Truckee River and the first real approach to the Sierra Nevada. This final desert crossing is shorter than the Great Salt Lake, but no less demanding. The party has done this before. They know the cost. They cross the 40-mile desert in stages, resting when they can, pushing forward when they must. The animals are weaker than they were, the people more tired. But they reach the Truckee River, and for the first time in weeks, they see green ahead, the dark forests of the Sierra foothills, rising toward peaks still touched with last winter's snow. The Truckee River is everything the Humboldt was not: clear, cold, rushing down from the mountains with a sound that feels like music after the silence of the desert. The travelers camp beside it, letting the animals graze on fresh grass, letting themselves rest in the shade of cottonwoods. There is relief in this camp, a sense that the worst of the desert is behind them. But the mountains loom ahead, and the calendar is not in their favor. It is now October. The passes of the Sierra are more than 7,000 feet above sea level, and snow can fall there at any time from autumn through late spring. In a normal year, the passes remain open until mid-November or later. But this is not a normal year, and the party is not on a normal schedule. They look up at the mountains, tracing the line of the trail as it climbs toward the summit. The peaks are beautiful, granite and pine, rock and snow, but they are also formidable. The party has already faced mountains in the Wasatch, but those were foothills compared to what lies ahead. The Sierra is the last barrier between them and California. In the evening, lanterns are lit, their glow reflecting on the surface of the river. Families sit together, speaking quietly about what is to come. Some are hopeful, trusting that they will reach the summit before the snow falls. Others are more cautious, aware of how much time has been lost, how thin their margin has become. The stars appear overhead, more vivid here than they were in the desert, the air cleaner and cooler. The sound of the river fills the night, a constant rushing that drowns out the smaller sounds of the camp. In the wagons, children sleep deeply, unaware of the calculations their parents are making, the worries they are not voicing. Tomorrow, the climb begins. If you've just joined us again, we are beside the Humboldt River, with the last wide plains behind and the mountains beginning to rise ahead. The wagon train reached the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada in late October of 1846. Behind them lay months of travel, the long miles across prairie and desert, the difficult passage through canyons and salt flats that had cost them precious weeks. Ahead rose the mountains, their granite peaks already dusted with early snow, their pine forests dark against a graying sky. The air had changed. It carried a sharpness now, a bite that had not been there on the plains or even in the desert nights. Breath turned visible in the mornings. Frost clung to canvas wagon covers until the sun climbed high enough to melt it away. The families paused near a small lake nestled at the base of the pass. The water lay still and dark, reflecting the surrounding tree and the clouds that drifted slowly overhead. Some would later call this place Truckee Lake, though the immigrants knew it only as a stopping point, a place to rest animals and gather strength before the final climb. The pass itself rose above them, a narrow gap between high ridges, the route that would carry them down into the California valleys they had traveled so far to reach. From where they stood, it still seemed open. Snow lay in patches on the higher slopes, but the trail appeared passable. There was reason for cautious hope. They made their first attempt to cross on a day when clouds hung low over the mountains. The wagons rolled forward, wheels creaking over rocky ground, oxen straining against their yokes as the grade steepened. The trail wound upward through stands of pine, the trees growing closer together as the elevation increased. Snow began to fall, lightly at first, small flakes drifting down through the branches and settling on hats and shoulders. The children watched with quiet fascination, catching snowflakes on mittened hands, not yet understanding what this weather might mean. By midday, the snow had thickened. What had been a dusting became a steady fall, covering the trail and making footing uncertain for both animals and people. The wagon slowed. Wheels that had rolled easily over dry ground now slipped in the accumulating slush. Oxen planted their hooves and pulled, but progress measured itself in feet rather than miles. The pass, which had seemed so close that morning, remained stubbornly distant. The snow continued, unhurried but relentless, filling the air with white and muffling every sound except the creak of wood and the labored breathing of the animals. As afternoon faded toward evening, the decision came quietly. They could not go forward, not today, not with the snow falling this heavily, and the trail becoming more treacherous with each passing hour. The wagons turned back, retracing the path they had climbed, returning to the lake where they had camped the night before. The descent was easier but no less somber. Families who had woken that morning believing they might sleep on the western side of the mountains now faced the reality that the crossing would have to wait. Perhaps tomorrow the snow would stop. Perhaps the trail would clear. Perhaps the pass would open again. They made camp near the lake shore as darkness settled over the mountains. Fires flickered into life, their light reflecting off the snow that now covered the ground in a thin white layer. Lanterns glowed from wagon interiors, where families gathered to eat their evening meals. The snow continued to fall, softer now but persistent, adding inch upon inch to what had already accumulated. The lake surface, dark and still, seemed to absorb the last light of day. The pines stood silent, their branches slowly bending under the weight of the snow that gathered there. In the days that followed, the emigrants made several more attempts to cross. Each time the snow drove them back. It fell and fell, accumulating faster than anyone had expected, burying the trail under drifts that grew deeper with each storm. The pass that had seemed so close now lay hidden beneath a white expanse that offered no passage for wagons, no safe route for families with children and elderly members and animals already weakened by the long journey. The realization settled slowly, like the snow itself, quiet but undeniable. They would not be crossing the Sierra before winter. They would be staying here, at the foot of the mountains, until the weather changed or help arrived. The lake became their anchor point, their reference in a landscape that was disappearing under white. The mountains rose around them, beautiful and indifferent, their peaks lost in clouds. The pines stood like sentinels, their dark green the only color against the endless snow. The families began to think not of crossing, but of sheltering, not of California, but of survival through the months ahead. The long journey that had brought them here, the thousands of miles from Missouri, the prairies and rivers and deserts, all of it had led to this quiet place at the foot of a pass that would not open. Evening brought a particular stillness to the camp. The wind died down as darkness fell, and the snow stopped for a time, leaving the world wrapped in silence. Lantern light glowed from wagons and tents, small points of warmth in the cold night. Families spoke in low voices, making plans, dividing tasks, trying to understand what the coming weeks might require. Children slept beneath piles of blankets, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air inside the canvas shelters. Outside, the snow lay undisturbed, a smooth white surface that reflected the faint light of stars when the clouds parted. The first chapter of their mountain ordeal had begun, though they did not yet know how long it would last or how much it would demand of them. For now, there was only the snow, the cold, the quiet lake reflecting a gray sky, and the pass above them, closed and waiting. If your mind has wandered, we are at the base of the Sierra, watching the first snows fall and the pass begin to close, the wagons settling into place for what will become a long winter's wait. With the pass closed and the snow continuing to fall, the immigrants turned their attention to shelter. The canvas wagon covers that had served them across the prairies offered little protection against the mountain cold. What they needed now were walls, roofs, structures that could hold warmth and keep out the wind that swept down from the peaks. The work began almost immediately, driven by the understanding that winter would not wait for them to be ready. Near the lake, some families found an abandoned cabin, a rough structure left by earlier travelers or perhaps by trappers who had passed through these mountains in years before. The cabin was small, its logs weathered and gaps visible between them, but it offered a starting point. Families crowded inside, sharing the limited space while others began building nearby. The sound of axes echoed across the snow-covered clearing, a steady rhythm that marked the days as logs were felled, trimmed, and fitted together into walls. The cabins that rose near the lakeshore were simple structures, built for necessity rather than comfort. Logs were notched at the ends and stacked, the gaps between them filled with whatever could be found, mud and moss and strips of cloth. Roofs were fashioned from branches and hides, anything that might keep out the snow that continued to fall. The floors were bare earth, packed hard by the feet of those who lived within. A single fireplace or fire pit provided heat, its smoke rising through gaps in the roof or through crude chimneys built of stacked stones. The interiors were dim, even during daylight hours. Windows were few and small, often just openings covered with oiled cloth or animal hide to let in a little light while keeping out the cold. Lanterns and candles provided illumination in the evenings, their flames casting flickering shadows on rough-hewn walls. Families arranged their belongings as best they could in the cramped spaces, creating small areas for sleeping, for cooking, for the simple activities that would fill the long winter days. The smell of wood smoke and damp clothing filled the air, mixing with the scent of whatever food was being prepared over the fire. Not all the immigrants reached the lake camp. The Donner families, traveling at the rear of the wagon train, had been delayed by a broken axle and other difficulties. By the time they approached the mountains, the snow had grown too deep for them to continue to the lake. They made their camp at a place called Alder Creek, several miles back from the main group. Here the shelters were even more makeshift than those at the lake. Without time to build proper cabins, the Donner families constructed lean-tos against fallen trees, using canvas and branches to create rough walls. They dug into the snow to create living spaces, the white walls around them providing some insulation against the wind. At Alder Creek, the sense of isolation was more profound. The families there could not easily visit the lake camp or receive visitors in return. The snow that lay between the two sites grew deeper with each storm, creating a barrier that would become increasingly difficult to cross. The Donner families settled into their shelters, tending their fires and rationing their supplies, hoping that the separation would be temporary, that the weather would ease and allow them to rejoin the larger group. Back at the lake, the camp took shape as a small community of cabins clustered near the water's edge. Each family or group of families occupied their own structure, though the boundaries between households blurred as people shared resources and assisted one another with construction. The work was exhausting, performed in cold that numbed fingers and made every task more difficult. But it was also necessary, and the immigrants understood this. Without shelter, they could not survive. Without walls and roofs and fires, the mountain winter would claim them all. The children adapted as children often do, finding ways to play even in the midst of hardship. They helped carry smaller branches and pieces of bark. They watched the adults work, learning the rhythm of construction, the way logs were fitted together and gaps were sealed. When their tasks were done, they played in the snow near the cabins, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the seriousness of the work around them. Their parents watched them with complicated emotions, grateful for their resilience, worried about what the coming months might bring. As the cabins neared completion, a kind of order emerged. Families knew where to find one another, which cabin belonged to whom, where the supplies were stored, where water could be gathered from the lake or melted from snow. The camp was not comfortable, not by any standard, but it was functional. It offered protection from the wind and a place to build fires. It offered walls to gather within and roofs to shelter beneath. In the context of their situation, trapped at the base of a mountain pass with winter closing in, This was enough to provide a foundation for what lay ahead. The lanterns glowed each evening as darkness fell, their light visible from cabin to cabin across the snow-covered clearing. Smoke rose from chimneys and through gaps in roofs, marking each occupied structure against the white landscape. The lake lay quiet nearby, its surface beginning to freeze around the edges as temperatures dropped. The mountains stood silent above, their peaks hidden by clouds, their passes buried under snow that would not melt for months. The camp was built. The shelters were ready. What remained was the waiting. If you're surfacing from a light sleep, we are inside small cabins and tents now, where families prepare to stay through the coming storms, the walls rough but standing, the fires lit against the cold. The days in the snowbound camps settled into a rhythm, a pattern of small tasks and quiet hours that repeated as the weeks passed. Morning arrived slowly in the mountain winter, the light filtering through gaps in cabin walls and the oiled cloth that covered small windows. Families woke to cold, their breath visible in the dim interior air, and the first task of each day was the same: build up the fire, coax warmth back into the cramped space, begin the slow process of making the cabin livable for another day. Firewood was the constant concern. The fires that heated the cabins and cooked what food remained needed to be fed continuously, and this meant gathering wood in conditions that grew more difficult as winter deepened. In the early weeks, wood could be found relatively close to the cabins, fallen branches and dead trees that could be cut and carried without venturing far. But as the snow accumulated, sometimes reaching depths of several feet, even short journeys became ordeals. Men and older boys waded through drifts that reached their waists, their clothing soaking through, their hands growing numb as they worked axes against frozen timber. The gathered wood was stacked near cabin doors, protected from the worst of the snow, but still exposed to the cold that kept everything frozen. Each piece was precious, measured not just by its size but by how long it might burn, how much warmth it might provide. Families learned to tend their fires carefully, adding fuel in small amounts to maintain a steady heat, rather than building roaring blazes that would consume their stores too quickly. The fire became the center of cabin life, the point around which everything else revolved. Food was rationed with equal care. The supplies that had seemed adequate for a journey now had to stretch across an uncertain number of months. What remained was counted and divided, portions measured out for each meal, each day, each person. The diet was monotonous and increasingly meager. Thin stews made from whatever meat remained, tough cakes baked from the last of the flour, boiled hides that provided little nourishment but filled empty stomachs. Children learned to eat what was placed before them without complaint, understanding in some unspoken way that there was no more to be had. The routine of meals gave structure to the days. Morning brought something warm if fuel and food allowed. A midday portion followed, usually smaller. Evening meals were eaten by firelight. Families gathered close, speaking in low voices about the day's work, the weather, the hope that rescue might come. The conversations were repetitive but comforting. The same topics revisited each night, the same quiet optimism expressed despite the circumstances. The firelight flickered on faces that grew thinner as the weeks passed, casting shadows that danced on rough log walls. Children occupied themselves as best they could in the confined spaces. There were no toys beyond what had been packed in wagons months before, and those were few. Games were invented, stories told, small tasks assigned to keep young hands busy. Some families had brought books, and these were read aloud by firelight, the words traveling around the cabin as listeners dozed or stared into the flames. Prayers were said, both the formal prayers of religious observance and the informal prayers of people hopping for deliverance. The rhythm of these activities, repeated day after day, created a kind of normalcy within the abnormal situation. The snow continued to fall throughout the winter months. Storms arrived with little warning, the sky darkening and the wind rising, and the snow descending in sheets that reduced visibility to nothing. During these storms, no one ventured outside except in dire necessity. Families stayed in their cabins, listening to the wind press against the walls, watching the drifts pile higher against doors that had to be forced open when the weather finally calmed. After each storm, the landscape was transformed. Familiar landmarks buried, paths that had been laboriously cleared now hidden beneath fresh accumulation. Between storms, there were moments of quiet beauty. The snow caught the light when the sun appeared, glittering across the surface of drifts in patterns that shifted with the angle of viewing. The lake, frozen solid now, lay smooth and white beneath the surrounding peaks. The pines wore caps of snow on every branch, their green barely visible beneath the white coating. Children sometimes played outside on calmer days, their laughter carrying across the silent landscape, a reminder that even in these circumstances, moments of joy could be found. But the beauty was cold comfort against the reality of their situation. The supplies continued to dwindle. The bodies of the emigrants continued to weaken. The hope that rescue would arrive, that the pass would open, that somehow this trial would end, flickered like the flames in their fireplaces, sometimes bright, sometimes barely visible but never quite extinguished. They marked the days as best they could, keeping track of time even when the sameness of each day made counting difficult. They waited, and they endured, and they held on to whatever warmth they could find, both physical and emotional. The cabin interiors grew familiar in every detail, every rough beam and gap between logs, every shadow cast by firelight, every sound of wind against walls. This was their world now, these cramped spaces with their smoky air and their small fires and their shrinking stores of food. Outside lay the snow and the mountains and the closed pass. Inside lay the quiet determination to survive until something changed. If you've wandered away in thought, we are passing the long snowbound days inside cramped shelters, measuring time by the fire, waiting for weather that might allow passage or rescue that might bring relief. As the weeks passed and supplies continued to diminish, the immigrants began to consider what had once seemed unthinkable, leaving the camps on foot, crossing the snow-covered mountains without wagons or animals, walking out to find help. The pass remained closed to wheeled vehicles, buried under drifts that no team of oxen could pull through. But perhaps some reasoned, a small group traveling light on foot might succeed where the wagons had failed. Perhaps they could reach the California settlements and bring back rescue for those who remained behind. The first attempts were informal, small groups setting out with little preparation, driven by desperation more than planning. These efforts failed quickly. The snow was too deep, the cold too severe, the distance too great for people weakened by weeks of inadequate food. They returned to the camps exhausted and discouraged, having made only a few miles before the conditions forced them back. The mountains did not yield to determination alone, but the idea of escape did not die with these early failures. A more organized attempt began to take shape, one that would involve better preparation and a realistic assessment of what the journey would require. The immigrants understood that they needed some way to travel over the snow rather than through it, and they set about making snowshoes from materials available in the camps. Oxbows were bent into frames. Strips of rawhide were woven across them to create a surface that would distribute weight and prevent feet from sinking into the drifts. The work was slow and the results were crude, but the snowshoes represented hope, a tool that might make the impossible possible. In mid-December, a group of 15 set out from the lake camp. They carried what food could be spared, barely enough for 6 days if rationed carefully, along with blankets and a few essential tools. The group included both men and women, those who were strong enough to attempt the journey and willing to risk it for the chance of reaching help. They left behind families and friends, promising to return with rescue, and climbed away from the lake into the high country. The journey that followed was brutal beyond anything they had anticipated. The snow in the high passes lay deeper than any of them had seen, drifts so profound that even with snowshoes they sometimes sank to their knees or waists. The cold was intense, biting through clothing that was never designed for such conditions, numbing fingers and toes despite constant movement. They traveled by day when they could and huddled together at night, building small fires when wood could be found, sleeping in piles to share body warmth when it could not. The food ran out after less than a week. They had underestimated both the distance and the difficulty of travel, and now they faced a choice between turning back to camps that had no food to spare or pressing forward into country they did not know, hopping to find sustenance somewhere ahead. They chose to continue. To turn back meant certain starvation. To go forward offered at least the possibility of survival, however slim. What followed in the days after the food was gone belongs to the most difficult part of this story. Facing starvation, some members of the group died from exposure and exhaustion. Those who survived faced a decision that no one should have to make. In order to live, some of them consumed the flesh of those who had already perished. This was done quietly, out of necessity rather than any other impulse, and it allowed the survivors to continue moving forward. We mention this not to dwell on it, but because it is part of what happened, a measure of how desperate the circumstances had become. The survivors of this snowshoe party, reduced now to a fraction of those who had set out, eventually reached the western foothills, and then, with the help of Native Americans who found them and provided food and guidance, made their way to the first California settlements. They arrived in January, barely alive, carrying news of the immigrants trapped in the mountains. Their arrival set in motion the rescue efforts that would eventually reach the camps, though those efforts would take weeks to organize and execute. Back at the lake and at Alder Creek, the families waited without knowing whether the snowshoe party had succeeded or failed. The days passed with no news, no sign of rescue, no change in the steady rhythm of survival. They continued to gather wood and ration food, to tend fires and care for one another, to hope that somehow help was on its way. The tracks left by the departing group had long since been filled by fresh snow. The mountains kept their silence, offering no indication of what had happened to those who had walked away into the white expanse. The snowshoe party's journey demonstrated both the terrible extremity of the situation and the lengths to which people would go in the hope of survival. It was neither heroic nor shameful in any simple sense. It was human, a response to impossible circumstances, and it would eventually prove to be the connection that linked the trapped immigrants to the outside world that had the means to help them. If your attention returns now, we are with the small groups who tried to walk out over the mountains, leaving tracks that filled almost as soon as they were made, their fates unknown to those who waited behind. In the months before the mountains closed around them, the emigrants had maintained connections to the world beyond their wagon train. Letters were written at stopping points along the trail and entrusted to travelers heading east, carrying news of progress and health to family members left behind. At forts and trading posts, information flowed in both directions: reports of trail conditions ahead, news from the settlements in California, updates on the movements of other immigrant parties. The overland journey was isolated in many ways, but it was not entirely cut off from the larger currents of communication that connected the frontier to the settled regions of the country. All of that ended when the snow closed the pass. The emigrants at the lake and at Alder Creek found themselves in a silence more complete than anything they had experienced on the trail. There were no letters coming in, no news of the outside world, no way to know whether anyone beyond the mountains knew where they were or what had happened to them. The last messages they had sent had been dispatched weeks before, from points far back on the trail, and those messages might or might not have reached their destinations. There was no way to know, and no way to send new word. The isolation was psychological as much as physical. On the trail, even when days passed without encountering other travelers, the immigrants had known that they were moving towards something, that each mile brought them closer to settlements where people lived and news circulated. Now they were stationary, held in place by the snow, and the settlements they had been traveling toward might as well have been on another continent. The mountain passes that separated them from California were measured in miles, but they might as well have been measured in months, because no message could cross them until the weather changed or until someone made the dangerous journey on foot. In the cabins, families speculated about what the outside world might know. Had word of their situation reached the California settlements? Were rescue parties being organized? Was anyone looking for them at all? These questions had no answers, and the uncertainty added to the weight of the waiting. Some chose to believe that help was surely on the way, that it was only a matter of time before rescuers appeared. Others prepared themselves for the possibility that no one was coming, that they would have to survive the winter on their own resources, or not survive at all. The silence extended even within the camps themselves. Travel between the lake and Alder Creek became increasingly difficult as the snow deepened, and days might pass without contact between the two sites. Families in one location knew little about conditions in the other. Were the Donners still alive? Were their supplies holding out? Was anyone sick? The answers to these questions were hidden behind miles of snow-covered forest, inaccessible until someone made the difficult trek between camps. When such trips did occur, the news exchanged was often incomplete, filtered through the exhaustion of the traveler and the difficulty of carrying much information across such demanding terrain. Inside the cabins, the absence of news created a strange quality of timelessness. The days blended together, distinguished mainly by the weather, whether it was snowing or clear, whether the wind was calm or howling around the walls. Without new information to process, conversation turned inward, to memories of home, to hopes for the future, to the immediate concerns of survival. The same stories were told again and again. The same observations about the weather were made each morning. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the walls, and the silence of the outside world seeped into everything. Yet the silence was not complete. There were the sounds of the camps themselves, the voices of family members, the cries of children, the rhythmic thump of axes cutting wood. There was the sound of wind in the pines, and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under the weight of snow. There was the sound of breathing in the night, of bodies shifting under blankets, of fires settling as logs burned down to coals. These small sounds became the texture of daily life, the audible evidence that life continued even in isolation. The emigrants could not know that their situation had become known in the California settlements, that the survivors of the snowshoe party had reached safety and spread word of the trapped wagon train. They could not know that rescue parties were being organized, supplies gathered, volunteers assembled for the difficult journey into the mountains. All they knew was the silence of the snow, the empty whiteness that surrounded them, the absence of any news from beyond the peaks that held them captive. They waited in that silence, tending their fires and rationing their food, hoping for a change they could not predict or control. The lantern light that glowed from cabin windows each evening marked islands of human presence in a vast white emptiness. From one cabin, you could see the glow of another, a small comfort in the darkness, evidence that others were enduring the same trial. But beyond the ring of cabins, there was nothing but snow and trees and mountains, a landscape that offered no messages, no signals, no indication of what lay ahead. If you're drifting in and out, we are in the quietest part of the story, when nothing seems to move beyond the ring of cabins and trees, and the world outside the mountains has fallen silent. Even in the most difficult circumstances, the emigrants found ways to care for one another. The camps near the lake and at Alder Creek were not simply collections of individual families struggling separately for survival. They were communities, bound together by the shared experience of the journey and the shared necessity of the present moment. When one family's supplies ran dangerously low, others shared what they could spare. When someone fell ill and could not perform the daily tasks of survival, neighbors stepped in to help. The kindness was quiet, often unspoken, but it was real and it made a difference. Food, the most precious resource in the camps, was shared despite its scarcity. A family that had managed to preserve a small store of meat might divide it with neighbors whose supplies had run out entirely. A portion of the thin stew cooking over one fire might find its way to a cabin where children had eaten nothing all day. These acts of sharing were not grand gestures, but small, repeated kindnesses. A bowl passed from hand to hand, a piece of dried meat pressed into a neighbor's palm. They were acknowledgments that survival in these conditions was not a matter of individual strength alone. The sick and the elderly received particular attention. In a situation where everyone was weakened by cold and hunger, those who had been robust at the journey's start remained stronger than those who had begun with less reserve. The stronger members of the community took on additional tasks, gathering firewood for cabins where no one was well enough to venture out, checking on those who lived alone or whose families were too depleted to provide adequate care. The work was exhausting, performed by people who were themselves hungry and cold, but it was done because it needed to be done. Children occupied a special place in the community's concern. Parents watched over their own children, of course, but they also watched over others. A mother who still had milk to nurse kept infants alive whose own mothers could not feed them. Older children helped younger ones, entertaining them during the long hours in cramped cabins, sharing blankets and body warmth during the coldest nights. The adults made conscious efforts to protect children from the worst of the reality around them, shielding them from sights and knowledge that would serve no purpose except to frighten. The sharing extended to labor as well as supplies. Building and maintaining the cabins was work that required more hands than any single family could provide. Men worked together to fell trees and lift logs into place. Women collaborated on the endless tasks of cooking and mending and caring for the young. The division of labor that had organized life on the trail continued in the camps, adapted to the new circumstances, but still recognizable, still functional. People knew their roles and performed them as best they could. In the evenings, the cabins became spaces of shared warmth in multiple senses. Families gathered around fires, and sometimes neighbors joined them, crowding into spaces that were already cramped but finding comfort in the company. Stories were told, memories shared, songs sung in low voices. The conversation was often mundane, focused on the immediate concerns of food and fuel and weather. but it served a purpose beyond information exchange. It reminded people that they were not alone, that others were enduring the same trial, that the community remained intact even as individuals weakened. Not every interaction was harmonious. The stress of the situation created tensions that sometimes flared into arguments or resentments. Disputes over food or space or perceived unfairness occurred, as they would in any group of people under extreme pressure. But these conflicts remained limited, contained by the understanding that division would serve no one's interests. The immigrants had traveled together for months before reaching the mountains. They had shared the trail, the river crossings, the difficult passages through canyons and deserts. That history of cooperation did not disappear because circumstances had grown harder. The lantern light in one cabin, visible from another across the snow, was a reminder of shared presence. The smoke rising from neighboring chimneys was evidence that others were keeping their fires burning, that the community was still alive. In the silence of the winter nights, when the wind died down and the snow stopped falling, families could sometimes hear voices from nearby cabins, muffled by distance and log walls, but still human, still present. These small evidences of community mattered. They were part of what allowed people to continue, to endure, to hold on until the circumstances changed. If your thoughts have been elsewhere, we are in the small kindnesses now, where survival is as much about sharing as endurance, and the light from one cabin reaches toward another across the snow. Word of the trapped immigrants reached the California settlements in January of 1847. The survivors of the snowshoe party, gaunt and exhausted after their harrowing crossing of the mountains, brought news that dozens of men, women, and children remained stranded near the summit of the Sierra Nevada. The story spread quickly through the small communities that had taken root in the Sacramento Valley, and almost immediately, efforts began to organize relief. The task was daunting. The same snow that had trapped the Donner Party made any rescue attempt dangerous and difficult. The passes remained buried under drifts that measured in feet, not inches, and the winter storms continued to sweep across the high country with unpredictable fury. Yet volunteers came forward, men who understood the mountains and were willing to risk the journey. Supplies were gathered from the limited stores available in the settlements: flour and dried meat, blankets and warm clothing, anything that might sustain the trapped families until they could be brought to safety. The first relief party set out in early February, a group of 7 men carrying packs of provisions on their backs. They traveled on foot, wearing snowshoes fashioned from whatever materials could be found, climbing steadily into country that grew colder and more forbidding with each mile. The going was slow. Even with snowshoes, the men sank into drifts that sometimes reached their waists. They built fires at night and huddled together for warmth, rationing their own supplies carefully so that enough would remain to share with those they hoped to find. After days of difficult travel, the rescue party approached the lake where the immigrants had made their camp. What they saw was both a relief and a shock. The cabins were still standing, their roofs visible above the snow, smoke rising from gaps that suggested fires still burning within. But the snow had accumulated so deeply that the structures were nearly buried. Doorways that had once opened at ground level now required climbing down through tunnels carved in the drifts. The landscape was transformed. The familiar shapes of cabins and trees, half hidden beneath a white blanket that seemed to erase all normal proportions. The rescuers called out as they approached, their voices carrying across the silent expanse of snow. Figures appeared at cabin doorways, emerging from the tunnels with expressions that mixed disbelief with desperate hope. The survivors were thin, weakened by months of inadequate food and relentless cold. Their clothing hung loose on frames that had shrunk during the long winter. But they were alive, and help had finally arrived. The relief party could not take everyone at once. Their supplies were limited, and the journey back across the mountains would be arduous even for those in reasonable health. Decisions had to be made about who would leave first. Priority was given to children and to those who seemed strong enough to survive the trek. Others would have to wait for subsequent rescue parties, remaining in the cabins with whatever provisions the rescuers could leave behind. The scene at the camps was quiet and orderly despite the emotional weight of the moment. Families said temporary goodbyes. Parents sometimes separated from children. Spouses parting with the understanding that reunion would come later, in the safety of the settlements. The rescuers distributed the food they had carried, instructed those remaining on how to ration it, and prepared to lead the first group of survivors back across the snow. Lanterns glowed from cabin windows that evening as the relief party and the first evacuees prepared for their departure. The light flickered against the snow, small beacons of hope in a landscape that had been so long defined by isolation and uncertainty. For those leaving, the journey ahead would be difficult. For those staying, the wait would continue. But the connection to the outside world had been reestablished. The silence had been broken. Help had come. The rescue parties would return multiple times over the following weeks, each trip bringing more survivors out of the mountains and delivering additional supplies to those who remained. The work was exhausting and dangerous, performed by men who received little compensation beyond the knowledge that their efforts were saving lives. They became, in their quiet way, essential workers in a crisis that demanded everything they could give. If you have just rejoined us, we are with the first relief parties, arriving on snowshoes to cabins half buried in the drifts, the silence of the mountains finally broken by voices calling out with news of rescue. The evacuation of the snowbound camps happened not all at once but in waves, each rescue party taking as many survivors as could safely make the journey across the snow-covered passes. The decisions about who would leave and who would stay were made with care, weighing the strength of individuals against the difficulty of the trail ahead. Children were prioritized when possible, along with those whose health had declined to the point where remaining in the camps posed the greatest risk. The journey out of the mountains was not a simple walk to safety. The same snow that had trapped the immigrants still lay deep across the passes, and the trail wound through terrain that demanded constant effort and attention. Adults who were weak from months of privation struggled to keep pace. Children, too young to walk long distances, were carried, their small bodies wrapped in blankets and lifted onto the shoulders of rescuers or relatives who somehow found the strength to bear the additional weight. The groups moved slowly, covering distances that would have been unremarkable in ordinary circumstances, but that now required hours of laborious travel. They followed in the tracks left by the rescue parties on their way in, though these tracks were often partially filled by fresh snow or obscured by wind. Rest stops were brief, taken in hollows where the snow offered some protection from the wind. Small fires kindled from whatever dead wood could be found. The warmth of these fires was fleeting, but it provided moments of relief before the travelers pushed on. The landscape through which they passed was beautiful in its severity. Snow-covered peaks rose on either side, their granite faces catching the winter light. Pine forests stood silent under their white burdens, the trees creating dark columns against the brightness of the snow. The air was cold and thin at the higher elevations, making breathing difficult for those already weakened by their ordeal. Yet with each mile traveled, each ridge crossed, the survivors moved closer to the lower elevations where the snow thinned and the air grew easier to breathe. Children experienced the journey in ways that adults could not fully share. For the youngest, the travel was a blur of cold and movement, of being carried and set down and carried again, of faces they knew and faces they did not. Some were too young to understand what was happening, aware only that the adults around them were moving with urgency towards somewhere that was supposed to be better. Older children walked when they could and were helped when they could not, their small feet wrapped in whatever protective coverings could be fashioned. The rescue parties that made these evacuation journeys performed remarkable feats of endurance and compassion. They had already crossed the mountains once to reach the camps, and now they crossed again, this time guiding groups of weakened survivors through terrain that challenged even the healthy and well-fed. Some rescuers made multiple trips, returning to the camps again and again until the last survivors had been brought out. Their names are less remembered than those of the trapped immigrants, but their work was essential to every life that was saved. As the groups descended toward the lower valleys, the snow gradually diminished. The drifts that had measured in feet gave way to patches of white among exposed earth and rock. Trees appeared without their heavy coats of snow, their branches bare but visible. The air warmed slightly, though it remained cold by any normal standard. For the survivors, these changes marked the passage from one world to another. From the frozen isolation of the mountain camps to the relative safety of the settlements below. The evacuations continued through February and into March, each party following the same difficult route, each group of survivors making the same slow journey from captivity to freedom. Not everyone who left the camps survived the journey out. The trail claimed some who had held on through the long winter, but could not endure this final passage. But most made it through, emerging from the mountains into a landscape that seemed almost impossibly green and warm after what they had experienced. If you have been floating in and out, we are on the rescue trails now, moving slowly downhill toward tree lines and then to lower valleys, the snow thinning beneath tired feet as the mountains gradually release their grip. When spring finally came to the Sierra Nevada, it revealed what the winter had hidden. The snow that had buried the camps began to melt, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher in the sky. Water trickled through the drifts, pooling in low places, running in small streams toward the lake that had been frozen for so many months. The ice on the lake's surface softened, cracked, and eventually broke apart, the dark water visible again for the first time since autumn. The cabins emerged from their white, covering-like structures surfacing from a dream. Roofs that had been invisible beneath feet of snow now stood exposed, their rough construction visible in the spring light. Walls that had been buried to their tops now showed their full height, the logs weathered and stained by the long winter. The tunnels that the immigrants had carved through the drifts to reach their doorways collapsed as the snow supporting them melted away, leaving strange depressions in the softening ground. Around the cabins, the evidence of the winter's occupation became visible. Tools that had been dropped or set aside and then buried by snow now lay where they had been left, their metal surfaces rusted by moisture. Pieces of clothing, scraps of leather, fragments of wagons that had been cannibalized for firewood or shelter materials. All of these emerged as the white covering receded. The camps had the appearance of places abandoned in haste, though in truth the departure had been gradual, stretched across weeks of rescue and evacuation. The last survivors had been removed from the camps in April, when the final relief party made its way up from the settlements to bring out those who remained. By that point, only a handful of people were still at the lake, individuals who had been too weak to travel with earlier groups or who had been left to await the improving conditions that spring would bring. Their rescue marked the end of the active crisis, though the work of recovery would continue for much longer. In the weeks and months that followed, some parties returned to the mountains to retrieve property and to document what had occurred. They found the camps much as the last survivors had left them, the cabins standing empty, the personal belongings of the immigrants scattered in and around the structures. Some of these items were collected and returned to survivors, or to the families of those who had not lived through the ordeal. Others were left in place to be gradually reclaimed by the mountain landscape. The lake itself, which had been the constant companion of the trapped immigrants, returned to its natural rhythms. Fish swam in its waters again. Birds appeared along its shores. The animals that had fled or hidden during the winter months began to reappear, their tracks visible in the soft mud left by the retreating snow. The mountains, indifferent to human suffering and human survival alike, resumed their seasonal cycles as if nothing unusual had occurred. The cabins would stand for years afterward, slowly deteriorating as weather and time did their work. Travelers passing through the area in subsequent years would sometimes stop to look at them, aware of the story they represented. Eventually, most of the structures would collapse or be dismantled, their logs reclaimed for other purposes or simply left to rot. But for a time, they remained as markers, quiet monuments to an experience that would not be forgotten. The lake that the immigrants had known as Truckee Lake would eventually be renamed Donner Lake, a permanent geographical reminder of what had happened there in the winter of 1846 and 1847. The pass above it would bear the same name. The landscape itself became a memorial, its features carrying the story forward even as the physical traces of the camps faded into the mountain soil. If you have returned to the story, we are in the early thaw, when the mountains begin to release their hold and the camps fall silent, the snow melting away to reveal what winter had hidden. The survivors who emerged from the mountains arrived in the California settlements in various states of health and spirit. Some had been relatively strong when rescue came and had weathered the journey out without major difficulty. Others were severely weakened, barely able to walk by the time they reached the lower valleys, requiring ongoing care and attention before they could begin to recover. All of them carried the weight of what they had experienced, a burden that would lighten with time but never entirely disappear. The settlements that received them were modest by any standard. Sutter's Fort, where many of the survivors were taken, was a walled compound of adobe buildings surrounded by agricultural land that was just beginning to be developed. It offered shelter and food, the basics of survival that had been so scarce in the mountain camps, but it was not a place of abundance. The settlers who lived there shared what they had, extending hospitality to strangers who arrived from the mountains with little more than the clothes they wore. The first days of recovery focused on the most immediate needs. Food was provided in careful portions, the survivors' shrunken stomachs unable to handle the quantities that healthy bodies would require. Simple broths and soft foods came first, gradually supplemented by more substantial fare as strength returned. Sleep came in the safety of rooms with solid walls and adequate warmth, a luxury after months of huddling in drafty cabins with insufficient fuel. Clean clothing replaced the worn and soiled garments that had served through the winter. The process of physical recovery was gradual but visible. Bodies that had been gaunt began to fill out as nutrition improved. Energy that had been depleted by months of privation slowly returned. The survivors started to move about the settlement, reacquainting themselves with the rhythms of normal life, the patterns of work and rest that had been impossible in the snowbound camps. Children began to play again, their laughter returning as the trauma of the winter receded. Emotional recovery followed its own timeline, less visible but no less important. The survivors had experienced losses that no amount of food or rest could erase. Families had been separated, some permanently. Friends and relatives had died in the camps or on the trails between. The memories of what had been endured, what had been witnessed, what choices had been made in extremity, these remained present even as the physical signs of hardship faded. Some survivors spoke freely about their experiences. Others preferred silence, carrying their memories privately. The settlements offered a kind of community that the survivors had not known since leaving Missouri. Neighbors looked after one another. Meals were shared. Work was divided according to ability and need. For those who had spent months isolated in mountain cabins, surrounded by snow and uncertainty, this return to normal human interaction was itself a form of healing. The simple routines of daily life, which had seemed so distant during the winter, became sources of comfort and stability. In the evenings, lanterns glowed from windows in the adobe buildings, their light visible across the compound and into the surrounding darkness. The survivors gathered in common rooms or in the quarters they had been assigned, speaking quietly about the day's activities, about plans for the future, about the lives they hoped to build in this new land they had traveled so far to reach. California, which had been an abstraction during the long journey, was now real and present. A place where recovery could happen and where new chapters could begin. The journey that had brought them here was over. The ordeal in the mountains was behind them. What lay ahead was uncertain but possible. A future that had seemed unreachable during the darkest days of winter, but that now spread before them like the California valleys themselves, wide and open and waiting. If you've dozed and wake again, we are in the aftermath, in rooms where survivors begin to eat, sleep, and speak in relative safety. The lantern lights steady on adobe walls. In the months and years that followed the rescue, the story of the Donner Party spread beyond California to the rest of the country, and eventually to the world. Survivors told their accounts to anyone who would listen, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes in response to official inquiries that sought to understand what had happened in the mountains. Journalists recorded these stories. Scholars analyzed them. The narrative took shape in newspaper articles, in books, in the growing archive of Western American history. The accounts varied in their details, as accounts of traumatic events often do. Memory is imperfect, shaped by emotion and time, and the survivors remembered different things with different degrees of clarity. Some were eager to explain and justify the choices that had been made. Others were reluctant to discuss certain aspects of the experience, preferring to let silence cover what words could not adequately address. The full picture emerged gradually, assembled from multiple perspectives into a story that was more complex than any single telling could convey. The more difficult elements of the story, the desperate measures taken by some members of the party when starvation became absolute, were addressed with varying degrees of frankness. Some survivors acknowledged what had occurred, explaining it as a necessity forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. Others avoided the subject entirely, or spoke of it only in the vaguest terms. The public reaction to these revelations was mixed, ranging from horrified fascination to sympathetic understanding. What was done in extremity was not easily judged by those who had never faced such extremity. Official inquiries examined the decisions that had led to the disaster. The choice to take the Hastings cutoff came under particular scrutiny, with some observers arguing that the immigrants had been misled by promoters, whose advice was based more on optimism than on accurate knowledge of the terrain. Lansford Hastings himself, whose guidebook had recommended the shortcut, became a controversial figure, though he was never held legally responsible for what had occurred. The inquiries produced reports and recommendations, guidance for future emigrants about routes and timing, and the dangers of departing from well-established trails. The lessons drawn from the Donner Party's experience influenced the advice given to subsequent waves of immigrants heading west. Guidebooks were revised to warn against shortcuts that had not been adequately tested. The importance of timing was emphasized, with clear recommendations about when parties should depart and how quickly they should travel to avoid being caught by early snow in the mountains. The infrastructure of westward travel improved gradually, with better roads, more reliable information, and clearer understanding of the challenges that the journey presented. For the survivors themselves, the years that followed brought varying fortunes. Some remained in California, building lives in the new communities that were growing rapidly, as the gold rush brought thousands of newcomers to the region. Others returned to the east, seeking to resume the lives they had left behind. A few achieved modest prominence, their names recognized in connection with the famous tragedy they had survived. Many lived quietly, their connection to the Donner Party known only to family and close friends. The passage of time transformed the story from current event to history, from news to legend. The physical traces of the camps faded, the cabins collapsing and disappearing into the mountain landscape. But the story persisted, passed down through generations, taught in schools, referenced in discussions of westward expansion and American resilience. The names Donner and Reed became synonymous with the larger narrative of overland migration, representing both the hope that drove the immigrant parties and the dangers that awaited them. Newspapers that had once carried fresh reports of the rescue now carried retrospective articles on significant anniversaries. Historians wrote detailed accounts based on primary sources and survivor testimonies. The story entered the realm of cultural memory, where it continues to reside, a reminder of how thin the line can be between success and disaster, between reaching the destination and becoming trapped along the way. If your mind has wandered, we are looking back from a distance now, at how the Donner Party's experience became part of the larger story of the Overland Trail, written in journals and newspapers, and the quiet memories of those who lived through it. And so we come to the end of this journey, having traveled in thought from the muddy streets of Missouri to the snow-covered passes of the Sierra Nevada, and finally to the sheltered valleys of California. We have walked alongside the immigrants as they loaded their wagons and said goodbye to the places they had known. We have crossed the prairies with them, following the slow curve of the Platte River under wide spring skis. We have watched them make the fateful decision to leave the main trail, choosing a shortcut that would cost them precious weeks and precious strength. We have stood with them at the foot of the mountains as the first snow began to fall, as the pass that had seemed so close slowly disappeared beneath the drifts. We have entered the cabins they built and occupied through the long winter, sharing in the routines of survival, the rationing of food, the gathering of firewood, the quiet hope that rescue would come. We have acknowledged the difficult choices some were forced to make when circumstances became extreme, choices that require neither condemnation nor detailed examination, only the recognition that they occurred. And we have followed the rescue parties as they crossed the snow to reach the camps, as they led survivors back down the mountain trails to safety, as the spring thaw revealed what winter had hidden. We have seen the survivors begin their recovery in the California settlements, eating and sleeping, and slowly regaining the strength that the mountains had taken from them. We have traced the story as it spread beyond the immediate participants into the larger narratives of American history and Western memory. The Donner Party's experience holds many lessons, though perhaps not the simple ones that are sometimes drawn from it. It is a story about hope and miscalculation, about the power of nature and the limits of human planning. It is a story about community and isolation, about the ways people help one another in crisis, and the ways they are sometimes forced to face extremity alone. It is a story that resists easy moral conclusions, asking instead for quiet reflection on the circumstances that shape human choices. If this telling has brought you some measure of rest, that is enough. The story will remain, held in books and archives and the landscape itself, waiting for those who wish to learn from it. For now, let the journey settle gently in your mind. Let the images of wagons and campfires, of snow-covered cabins and lantern light, of mountain passes and valley settlements find their places in your memory. And let yourself drift toward whatever rest awaits you. If you're hovering between waking and sleep, we are simply gathering the threads of the journey and laying them down gently, the story complete, the path now quiet.